turnover of the ASEAN chairmanship in Laos, President Duterte said the Philippines will highlight ASEAN as a global player, but with the interest of its citizens at heart. The Philippines' ASEAN chairmanship next year coincides with the 50th anniversary of regional cooperation.
In the last 2 days of our meetings, I have benefited immensely from our discussions and exchanges, providing me with insights on how best to build upon Lao PDR's efforts in community building. During the Philippines chairmanship, we will highlight ASEAN as a model of regionalism and a global player with the interests of the people at its core. We will pursue initiative and enhance cooperation with global partners to ensure that ASEAN citizens live in peace, stability, security, and growth.
And here to give us his assessment on President Duterte's debut on the international stage is political analyst Richard Heydarian. Thank you for coming back to Head Start.
My pleasure, as always.
All right, so what is your take? How do you rate President Duterte's first international outing? You have Secretary Yasay saying words like brilliant, superb.
Right.
What's yours?
Well, it was definitely a kind of a mixed baggage, mixed picture, but you could also say it was a qualified success. I mean,
how?
Surely in one area there was a hiccup, particularly with respect to the United States. I personally was expecting President Duterte to have a much more statement-like, composed side of him revealed during the forum. Remember, this was a forum where we were supposed to officially accept the chairmanship of the ASEAN. And President Duterte could not have asked for a more high-profile global diplomatic debut. Can you imagine the leaders of India, Japan, China, United States, and the Secretary General of United Nations were all there. So this was a global diplomatic debut for him. And of course, Duterte also promised shortly after his victory that he's going to metamorphose from a caterpillar to a butterfly. So I thought that this is the time that this is going to come out. So unfortunately, the problem happened in the pre-departure press conference. But once he stepped into Laos, actually, he said, I don't want to pick a quarrel with President Obama. The next day, there was a statement released that kind of expressed his regret.
Yes.
Yeah. So there was already a damage control happening there. President Obama came out and said, I didn't take the insults personally against me. I understand that's a manner of speaking for President Duterte. And then Ben Rhodes, the Deputy National Security Advisor, said that our relationship with the Philippines is still rock solid, right?
Yeah.
So the damage control was being done, although I was quite surprised that towards the end, President Duterte had a spirited speech on human rights and again went back to history and showed the picture showing America's atrocities.
I think we should talk about that. So here's President Duterte clearly. I mean, here's a guy wherein many say he was misunderstood. He technically didn't curse the president personally, although, I mean, that goes, it depends who's reading the transcript. I'll be honest with you. But then at the end, here's President Duterte, who some say can't just help himself.
Right.
Well, okay, let's talk about that. He didn't read the prepared speech. He ditched it.
Yeah. He's definitely a rough diamond. I mean, if you look at the transcripts and speeches of President Duterte, much of it actually makes sense. I mean, if you're a scholar, you're a progressive person, sometimes he sounds like Bernie Sanders, not that much Trump when he talks about anti-colonialism, respect for minorities, and he always tries to remind other countries that before you lecturing us or questioning us, get your own house in order. And no one can question that the United States also has a very storied human rights record, even up until today. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, you cannot disagree with a lot of things that he's saying, but the problem is that he violates the #1 rule in Diplomacy 101, which is you don't use expletives. No matter how critical you are of your friends or your rivals, you never use expletives. I mean, strongman people like Vladimir Putin always get into these kinds of very feisty exchanges with the United States, but they never use expletives. So I think that is something that we really have to get rid of. Second, you never wash your dirty laundry in the public.
Okay,
the problem
how did he do that?
I think the problem was with both sides, right? The thing with President Obama is, I know as a constitutional lawyer, human rights issues are very close to him. There are people like Samantha Power, the UN ambassador, who is also concerned with the human rights situation in the country. Sure, no problem with that. But I think President Obama should not have put the issue of human rights front and center whenever he was asked, what are you going to do when you're going to meet Duterte? He kept on saying, I'm going to talk about human rights. So I think that a little bit ticked off Duterte. What Obama should have done was to say, we're going to discuss a range of issues, and one of them is our concerns with human rights. But by putting that front and center, I think it set the stage for some sort of spirited exchange with Duterte. And then the problem with Duterte is this. I mean, he surely has some disagreements with the United States, particularly the issue of human rights. But these are the things that you have to discuss in private, in one-on-one talks. They should have had a very frank discussions, candid discussion behind the scenes. But in the public, you always emphasize the glass half full. We have a range of issues whereby we have complete agreement with the United States on counterterrorism. We were just a victim of terrorism a few days ago. And the United States is completely indispensable for us in terms of logistics, training, and intelligence. They could have talked about us. We could have talked about the West Philippine Sea. President Obama came out and said that the verdict in The Hague was legally binding and China should comply with that. So President Obama is taking his diplomatic capital to support our arbitration case against China.
That's a very good point.
And not to mention trade and investment issues that we can also talk about. So my point was, we should a little bit de-emphasize areas of disagreement, which clearly is human rights, and more emphasize areas of common interest and convergence. And this is something where we had some sort of a problem.
All right, let's take your points piece by piece. They're quite interesting. You said Obama used his political capital, his diplomatic capital, in a way, to support the ruling, to support our cause. In the U.S.-ASEAN summit, President Duterte did not show up. They said he was fatigued. He was not feeling well. And you have Obama, wherein he had a bit of a controversy. They call it in CNN a bit of a dust-up with Duterte. And he said the ruling is binding. He wants China to be able to respect the ruling. So you have Obama stepping up for the cause of the country. And Duterte was nowhere there. What does that say?
Right, I mean, the thing is this.
What message did that give?
The United States has somehow been relying on the Philippines for the past few years to forge this unity and coherence within the ASEAN to stand up to China on the issue of the South China Sea. And that was what our legal arbitration case was all about, and we were luckily very victorious. So now suddenly you have this kind of incongruence whereby the United States is more talking about our arbitration case than the Philippines. But this is where you could say that his trip was kind of also a success, because first of all, much of the ASEAN welcomed President Duterte's more pragmatic approach towards China. There was a feeling that President Aquino was too hawkish towards China, putting too much pressure on his peers to stand up to China, and they were not comfortable with the potential collision course with China.
But that's a very Asian thing.
That's a very Asian thing.
That's very Asian,
and the thing that Duterte always says, we have to settle our disputes among ourselves. We should not multilateralize it. So I think that is something that sat very well with a lot of countries. So ironically seen as a dove as compared to Aquino when it comes to regional diplomacy towards China.
So you have a good point. You're saying that Duterte is accepted depending on who's looking. You're saying if it's an ASEAN leader or if it's the Chinese leader, they're receiving Duterte in a warmer light.
I mean, that's why I said it's a qualified success. There was definitely a dust-up, a hiccup, a tiff with President Obama and slight with the United Nations. But if you look at his interaction with the rest of the region, it was extremely cordial. I mean, Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan, had almost a kind of fan mode interaction with him. He said, you're very famous in Japan. The rest of ASEAN kind of welcomed his more pragmatic statements on China and how dealing with the South China Sea issue. And remember...
So depending on who's looking. Whose perspective.
And majority, I think, had no problem with Duterte. And I would say a lot of them perhaps were glad that he was pushing back against Western criticism on human rights. Remember, much of ASEAN are autocratic regimes. They're barely democracies in this region, and none of them also don't want to be criticized by the West. So they kind of like saw him as the big tough guy standing up to the West. Remember, there's a strong sense that the West, you know, is too much meddling in the domestic affairs of countries in the region. So in that sense, whether we agree or not, he was actually seen like a rock star by the rest of Asia, particularly countries that did not raise any issue with respect to the human rights. So the hiccup was really with the United States and slightly with the United Nations, but the rest of the region was very welcoming of President Duterte, and they were prepared for him. They knew the guy was unorthodox.
Yeah.
So even when he made that kind of controversial statements like U.S. crime against Moros, one of the comments from one of the ASEAN leader was, "It's the typical Duterte." Like
Really?
we saw it coming. This is not extremely surprising.
But then you have President Obama refusing to shake hands with him in the end.
Well, I just got to know it now.
Here's the guy who said, I don't take his comments personally.
Yeah.
It's his manner of speaking. It's a habit. But clearly, when that came out, I mean, would it be...
My point is this. I don't think this will affect our relationship in a significant way. Obama is stepping out. He doesn't want to rock the boat when he's stepping out. I think he wants to show that the relationship are too deep, too institutionalized, to suffer any fundamental breakdown because of these temporary setbacks. But nonetheless, I think something more fundamental is happening here. President Duterte is very clearly signaling that he wants a much more independent foreign policy. Maybe the way he's doing it is not the most sophisticated and calibrated way, but the signal is very clear. Also to China, that don't worry about it, I'm going to handle my own foreign policy and no one can tell me what to do because I am the head of a sovereign nation. We're not a vassal of any country.
That's his message.
That's his message, and it's very clear. And the other thing is this. Our relationship with the United States remains robust, but it doesn't look as sacrosanct and special as before. Let's be very honest about it. Previous Filipino presidents were much more deferential to the United States and much more in sync. Clearly with Duterte, he's not following the script and he's essentially saying, I have my own script. So this is the new normal in our bilateral relationship with the US, and Hillary Clinton and God forbid Donald Trump, if he wins, they have to be prepared for a new kind of interaction, a new quality in bilateral relationship with the United States.
All right. This is actually, your point of view is quite interesting because you give both sides.
Right.
Your sides is, one is how maybe the U.S. saw the ASEAN summit with Duterte, and the other side that you're telling us is how Asia saw the ASEAN summit with Duterte.
Definitely.
And I want to ask you this right now. Is it also one of the reasons, the fact that when you watch cable and international media, it is very pro-American?
Yep.
I mean, if you look at every story that is airing on cable today, I don't want to mention the networks, but it is all about Duterte and Obama.
Right.
I mean, it has skipped everything else about how ASEAN sees Duterte. Do you see media as, in a way, a factor in making his image, I mean, I don't want to say this, worse or misunderstood?
I mean, this is my frustration. That's why I said there's another side to this story, which is he's extremely cordial and very productive meetings with the rest of Asia, which was the vast majority of people who participated in the meeting. And look at his interaction with Jokowi, with Medvedev, with Chinese leader, with Japan. Everything went well, smoothly. It was really with the United States that you had a hiccup. Well, the thing is this, people are so used with the Philippines and US always being in sync, so that was shocking. The second thing is that Duterte has an international reputation. In the Philippines, we try to decode Tatay Digong. We understand the so-called context, although let's not overuse the word context. We understand the subculture. The international media doesn't pay attention to that. You know, they're covering so many people. They don't have time to go to the details of that. So there's definitely going to be some gap between how we cover Duterte and how the Western media covers. The second thing is that President Duterte also said certain things about the American ambassador in the past.
Exactly.
So he also set the tone already. So unfortunately, there's already kind of a prejudgment towards Duterte. So whenever he makes a statement, the Western media doesn't pay attention to perhaps 90% of his speech that could be sensible and legitimate. They always look for or pay attention to that 1% that tends to be problematic.
No.
And that's why we have to be very careful.
But Richard, what will this cost us? We're talking about 6 years of President Duterte. He's voted by 16.6 or 16.8 million people. And he's quite popular with all the Filipinos abroad. But let's face it, we have a problem with the West Philippine Sea. Even after the ruling, our fishermen still can't go there. And Duterte's campaign slogan was to the U.S. is, are you with us? Are you against us? My question is he making it harder considering the U.S. are considered our friends.
Right, right. He's absolutely right to put the United States a little bit in the spot and say, please clarify the extent of your bilateral security agreement with us, because the U.S. was always clear that, for instance, the Senkaku DIU, which are disputed between Japan and China, clearly fall within their 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. They never made any comparable statement, even on the Scarborough Shoal, which is only 110 nautical miles away from our shores, and the Chinese could build facilities there any day.
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be more sense of urgency on the part of the United States, and clearly there is frustration. The difference is that Duterte is very open about expressing that frustration, while the previous presidents perhaps were a little bit more circumspect about that. Now, hopefully that will nudge the United States towards giving us more guarantee and more commitment.
And why would they do that? I mean, just to balance the conversation. Here you are, you're the U.S., you're the most powerful country in the world. Here's President Duterte acting this way. He's not that friendly towards you. If you're the U.S., what's in your interest to act quicker and to nudge you to move?
Right. The first thing is, of course, the question of credibility. But let's not also over-exaggerate the issue of credibility. The second issue is the United States also has an interest to make sure that Chinese missiles are not 110 nautical miles away from Subic and Clark and pointing at Americans. They definitely have an interest in that. So they're very worried about what's happening there. I know the Americans have some contingency plans, but maybe they have to be much more explicit about their support, much more concrete and tangible about their support. Yes, they're giving us around $40 million in maritime security funds, $70 million in terms of foreign military financing, but that's not enough when you're dealing with a country like China, which is spending $150 billion on its defense spending. So in short, we appreciate America's help, but we need more than that. Nonetheless, this is not a pretext for us to use expletives against American leaders. This is not a pretext for us to create unnecessary diplomatic tensions. Why? Because as we deal with China, which is the right thing to do, at the end of the day, you have to solve it directly with the country. And for me, it's neither a question of bilateralism or multilateralism. You have to combine it. You have to have bi-multilateral approach. So in ASEAN and international fora, we put pressure on China, but also directly deal with them to negotiate a modus vivendi in the South China Sea. The problem is this. I have my doubts with China. I fear that maybe they're taking us for a ride. Because on one hand, they're saying we want dialogue if you set aside the issue of arbitration. But on the other hand, they're sending some of their, their indication that there's a prelude to some sort of a construction activity in Scarborough Shoal. So that belies their claims to be open to having a mutually satisfactory compromise. Remember, a lot of our fishermen are just waiting for the signal to go ahead and exploit what is our right. The Hague verdict made it very clear. The Scarborough Shoal is a traditional fishing ground, not only for China, but for multiple countries, and they have no right to block off our fishermen.
So I want to ask you, do you feel President Duterte is acting quite naively when it comes to China? Is he putting too much trust?
I think it's too early to say that. If within 6 months to 1 year, nothing happens, Duterte has to change tact. He has to shift gear and go back to a much more confrontational approach. And that's where we need United States. We cannot afford to estrange America because they're our ultimate hedge against a Chinese mischief.
And I think just factually speaking, they are they're the only country that's our treaty ally. I mean, that's a fact.
Exactly.
We have a treaty only with the United States.
Yes.
So, okay. Now, let's talk about the ASEAN summit. You have President Duterte who didn't show up at the UN ASEAN Summit meeting and at the US ASEAN Summit meeting. I've been hearing some comments saying he's folding up. I mean, parang nahiya na not to show up. I mean, considering he's had very strong comments about both leaders. Do you feel that's what happened?
Let's put it this way. Some could say this is a baptism of fire in terms of diplomacy, global diplomacy for President Duterte.
Some have said it's amateur hour. Would you agree?
I mean, the thing is this. He went from mayor of Davao to head of a state of an increasingly important country. So he didn't have as much experience as other people who were first senators or foreign minister before they became presidents.
But so did Widodo. He was mayor.
Yes, but the thing is this, Widodo doesn't have such a big disagreement with the United Nations and US on the human rights issue, despite the death penalties being rekindled in Indonesia. But the Western media is really focusing on the human rights issue in the Philippines, and Duterte is really, perhaps they feel they're under siege. So I think maybe he really just had a migraine because remember, he canceled some of his campaign speeches before, so probably it's true. But of course, the impression of other people is that maybe he just felt too awkward to go there. But my point is this. Remember, they said they did not cancel the meeting with President Obama. They just postponed it. Obama will still be there until January. So there's still an opportunity for them to have a talk, whether directly or through phone. And let's remember, President Obama was the first head of state who called Duterte. So this is not the first time that they're interacting with each other. I hope that we arrange some sort of meeting very soon. But from what I know, the first state visit of Duterte most likely will be to China. So it's important we manage the optics, because this could come off wrong in the US. They may interpret it, is it like kind of abandoning the American ship? I don't think that's the case. I think President Duterte very intelligently is trying to create a healthy distance between Philippines and all superpowers so that we can deal with them in ways that are in consonance with our national interests, and we don't side with US, for instance, against China or China against US. But the optics are not optimal. Let's be very honest about that. That is why it's the job of Foreign Secretary Yasay, it's the job of the press team to really up the ante and make sure that there's no unnecessary misunderstanding, and whatever hiccup happened now will not have long-term repercussion. Yes, Obama is stepping out, but most likely, and I hope perhaps, that the fellow Democrat will be the next American president, and they're watching very carefully the interaction between Obama and President Duterte. And if the Western media continues to have this kind of negative coverage of Duterte, that will put constraints on how President Clinton most likely will be able to deal with Duterte. Remember, she made a very tough statement.
Yes.
That you don't insult our president. That's the least we can do is to cancel the meeting. So you already see that Hillary Clinton is drawing the line in quite a hard line way, right? So we have to make sure that this will not extend to the next administration. And as much as we want to do damage control with President Obama, we set a positive tone for the next president. We still have a few months, 4 to 5 months. It's enough time, but we need to accelerate our learning curve. It has to be much more steep.
Okay, you've called, and many other observers have said this is diplomacy one-on-one. Some have said it's amateur hour. You've called them a rough diamond. What is the responsibility of the communications team?
Right.
I mean, I've read Teddy Boylocsin's editorial, and he frankly said that the communications team could be doing more in briefing President Duterte, in, for example, also timing. Like, he ends up having speeches and then accepting questions right after, which tends to push him to reply in this way. And he had a press con right before leaving. I spoke to a former press secretary who said was not even necessary, which put Duterte in a bind once again, given these are his weaknesses. He's easily pushed or ticked, so to speak. What is the responsibility of the communications team?
Remember, we said the first rule is no expletives, no matter how irritated and tired you are. The second is don't wash your dirty laundry in public. The third rule is sometimes silence is the best response, or leave it to your press secretary. If you look at President Obama, he's an extremely articulate guy, but two things. He always makes sure that he sticks to the talking points, and most of the time he leaves the explanation to his press secretary who have done enough preparation. We know that President Duterte is used to spontaneous speeches. That may be fine in the domestic scenario. That has given tremendous amount of political success to him, but global diplomacy is a whole different ballgame. You see, we Filipinos will adjust to our president. We elected him, and we respect the will of the people. But you cannot expect the world to adjust to President Duterte. I think that's too much to ask.
All right. On that note, Richard, thank you for coming to this show.